Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and Colorado. Some would say that my work is about love, gentrification, and psychology. In its simplest description, though, my work is about memory. Specifically, I'm interested in cognitive processing and mental representations as understood in semantic and episodic memory. The projects that I've made have contended with the act of forgetting, writing as a form of memorial, and documentation as an approach to marking sites of passage. The subjects that exist in my work are elusive, rarely resolved, and reside within spaces of disorientation. I've been making work about being unsettled in space since as long as I can remember. My interest in the in-between has been a defining element of my practice because it is a defining element of my identity. The archive, which has been written on ad nauseum, is a fugitive object. In making text and image-based works, I've been interested in accessing personal archives to stitch together narratives that border alongside fiction. That is to say, all forms of representation are beholden to a layer of subjectivity. Is it fact or is it fiction? What happens in between? But as I moved away from utilizing interpersonal dialogues in my work, I found that the importance of an archive is often what is hidden in the details of it. What can be found on the back of a photograph, the hand notation on an index card, or the eccentric categorization systems of those who collect material things. To me, this is all a form of writing, even when it was perhaps not intended to be. I've been using image making to picture language, like I've been utilizing language to create mental images, but it's the space where the two collapse that is most captivating to me. So while these projects are a representation of a wide range of meanings, it's the relationship between language and imagery that is collapsible that reminds me of what the archive can do. It is both artifact and fiction, misplaced and found, traveler and destination. Okay, so the project I want to talk about is called Stratagems, Orange County. And just to contextualize a little bit about what this work is, it's a work in progress that I've been working on for the last couple of years. And it's in the form of an autoethnography, which includes several histories, although I'm certain that there are many scholars who are much more eligible to write them. I think that as an artist, though, there's a responsibility that is unique to using archival research, and particularly when a project is concerned with bringing awareness to underrepresented narratives. So this text excerpt is from a preface to this project that I'm working on in the book form, and it's a little long, but I think it's important to provide a lens into the way I'm seeing regarding my own positionality. So I'm just going to read the beginning part of that excerpt, and it's titled "For All Its Beauty and Its Transgressions." There is no ground. I've thought about this for most of my life, how time seems to be held in suspension between distances across segments of light. I was born on a Friday the 13th in 1987, the same year as Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera was published, the same decade that Ronald Reagan's conservatism had swept the country and the county I would learn to call home. My entrance into this world was marked by a transracial adoption that took nearly 33 years to understand, countless documents and archives later before fully having a sense of my history, although it is never resolved. I've spent a decade writing about seasickness, about disorientation and instability as a way of being. I have understood the world intimately through a lens of otherness, of never quite having resolution about the deepest parts of myself, something that my parents could have never prepared me for because phenotypically we would never belong to one another. I wouldn't change a thing, but I think that I will always wonder what it is like to be Mexican, something present in my blood but absent in my culture, something I will likely spend the rest of my life trying to pin down only to find it one step out of reach. You can never be white enough and brown enough at the same time. To be mixed race and to not have connections to your biological lineage positions you as a marooned ship, always searching without finding a home. Home becomes an intellectual invention, a place for myth-making where the land you set foot on becomes more of your identity than the absent practices of knowing the difference between patria and la raza. Over time, I've become familiar with the language anyway, just like I've learned to identify the complex differences between indigeneity and Latin America, Spanish colonization, and the whitewashing present in mestizo mestizaje. But to overcome the disjointedness of having a German surname while having no biological relationship to its etymology creates an unrelenting dissonance between societal perception and lived experience. It is absorbed into an archive that is not your own. In an attempt to mark the nature of whiteness that I have found damaging, this is an exploration of self, of underrepresented histories, of the problems within Orange County that are often misunderstood. It is also an attempt to reconcile a lifetime of not belonging, pushing beyond a conventional framework for how we might understand home, suspended somewhere between light, distance, and longing. So one of the central images in this body of work is the orange tree, which comes from my childhood home. Many of the homes in Southern California, for those of you from there, know that they grow citrus and they exist on plots of land that were formerly agricultural grounds. So it's hard to look at agricultural imagery in California without being reminded of migrant labor. So often Mexican workers used to tend to the state's population of produce production. It's also hard to forget the state's brutal anti-Mexican and anti-immigrant history and current sentiment. Orange County succeeded from Los Angeles in 1889, choosing orange as the county's name simply as an aesthetic choice. The idea of manifest destiny can be witnessed in many parts of the archival objects that exist in the public collections within the county. So this particular text is printed from a pamphlet of the Rancho Mission Viejo subdivisions, which exists on former ranchos that were developed, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s. And much of the work that I've taken in this project has slowly been through like digging within other people's archives that exist in these public facing special collections. So understanding how visual and textual representation are connected to the county's ethos and ideologies. Orange County is also located on the territories of the Tongva and Ashamen people. Spanish colonization in the 1700s impacted the way that large land parcels were divided up as ranchos, including central landowning families. So later, those landowning families would sell off the land parcels to the County of Orange's Orange County Park System, formerly Harbors, Beaches, and Parks. I grew up in these parks because my dad was a park ranger, so I spent most of my childhood in these spaces. And Orange County is also divided between North and South County at a time when central real estate was being developed in South County, predominantly catering to white conservative families. So the land is generally known as being demarcated by mega churches, strip malls, and master planned communities. One of the ways that I use imagery is to complicate how beauty might be understood. So I'm interested in poetic imagery and language as a hook that leads to rupturing the surface of how a photograph or the written word might be interpreted. And in that relationship to language, there are questions of the politics of representation. So how archival documentation can tell us stories that we can't always see in writing. The strike through specifically on this image on the right, which says features of orange packing that has the handmark through, rewritten as wetbacks on ladders, and how those ideologies are rendered visible through categorization. So this specifically was in the Irvine family's archive, and they have a long and complicated history in the region. So anti-Mexican sentiment is a defining feature of Orange County, and the rhetoric of quote unquote illegals and plenty of other derogatory labels and slurs are hurled against brown people in this community and have been for a very long time. So I can speak to this specifically because my entire existence in the county has been defined by being told things like this and going back to where you come from, and ironically, like no one really understanding what that means. So oranges have this iconic symbolism and imagery in the county, but they're fraught with so many tragedies that exist within people's lives, specifically in terms of harvesting them. So one such story in 1936, the Citrus War, which is hardly talked about, was a countywide civil war with over 125 strikes staged by workers. And so the growers were viewing this possible dissatisfaction with the citrus workers as a questioning of their lives. So in terms of the growers being those who hold power and the workers as being those who are protesting against that power system. One of those forms of oppression took place in which the harvesters consistently named Mexican nationals as those who were the laborers for potentially striking as a Mexican revolution. And so they instigated such a response in which the sheriff's department brought CHP officers and essentially with deputized people, followed them armed with axe handles and shotguns and instructed them to kill anyone who was striking and trespassing on the groves. So this is a less talked about history, but this is a central component of one of the histories that this project looks at. California is often viewed as such a beautiful and serene destination. And as some may know, Reagan once said of Orange County, it's the place where good Republicans go to die. But I don't know a single person of color who grew up in Orange County or who continues to have relationships to it who has not been terrorized by the ideologies of people like Reagan, white nationals, and the religious right. So that relationship to beauty, I think, as a means for complicating how we might enter into the sort of perception of a space such as California, and more specifically, Southern California. We are also a state that is known for our land and our fires and our agricultural production. And so some of the images that I'm looking at in the archives really are rooted in all of the land relationships. And so that comes up both in the video-based work that I'm making, the book, the writing, and the still imagery. This is kind of looking out in terms of grounding oneself in ways of looking, specifically in South County, which is the majority of this project is about Southern Orange County. And some of this work, maybe people have seen it, is outside at PPAC and still up. This particular piece is the image that I had shown in the beginning, the home, the childhood home family images, but then also this text piece, For All Its Beauty and Its Transgressions, which bracket that central image. And the relationship to the land, I think, is really the central lens at which I'm looking at this project. So thinking about how does identity form in geography, especially over duration, so spending extensive time in nature, but then also the complexity of that land, which is colonized land, which has been land that is unceded, land that essentially was developed based on privilege. And so a lot of the research that I'm looking at is about how that land was divided, who owned the rights to it, why it was developed in the ways that it was, why certain natural preserves were preserved, whereas other land was just not considered, and how that connects to race and ethnic aspects, as well as class aspects of who was in power. And I spoke a little bit about my relationship to disorientation in the beginning. I think all of these images sort of exist in these spaces off the concept of terra incognita, which are spaces on early maps that were unknown or spaces that had not yet been colonized. And so my current research asks questions about the unknown through sites of dislocation and belonging. So this is one of the first images, like pairing of images that I started when working on this project. And I have been wanting to produce something connected to California for a long time, as it is my longest standing home. But I think that the relationship to Orange County, especially for those who are from there, know like it's a really complicated place to be from. And in many cases, people have left, people do leave, I think because of misalignment, with a community and not feeling comfortable within a community. So it's been a complex process of trying to reconcile some of those spaces and figuring out what the role of writing and image making does in this particular context, what the kind of goals are overall, how to approach issues of identity without feeling sort of canonized in a specific way or delimited in the way that I think a lot of artists, specifically artists of color, struggle with, and the ways that we so easily latch on to being a monolith of something, which I really cannot speak to. And so the work has almost decentered itself in terms of portrait representation. I don't work in the portrait often. I really think about the landscape and how the landscape can sort of stand in for those missing pieces. These are same oranges. They are continuous motif throughout. I'm also really interested in the use of double exposure, which is something that comes up in a lot of my work, specifically previous works, but also a little bit in this project, of that sort of latent image that through the use of something like pack film, you can create multiple exposures and you can shift ground within the image itself, which connects a lot to the writing. So some of the images more are standalone images, such as this one, that are meant to be experienced in that way versus something that's a little bit more grounded. And all of this work is in production to become a book, which is probably years away from being finished, but it is going to be a project that has both essays, longer form essays, and connections to actual research. So the importance of citing the histories that are included in the project, and also finding a way to kind of work through metaphor and creative writing, which is more common in my practice. And so it's brushing up against those spaces of like how to punctuate research, archives, other people's work that has already been completed. And so the idea for this is that eventually it would be in about maybe like a 200-page book that contextualizes all of that. And this quote is in here from Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot's Silencing the Past in the chapter, The Power in the Story. And Trouillot marks the space between fact and fiction in a way that I think is quite relevant to the archival research of this work. Bringing our attention to history is always produced in a specific historical context. So historical actors are narrators and vice versa, which makes me think about the way in which the archive gets considered. So the materials that I've been looking at have been between the University of California, Irvine's special collection in the Orange County Archive, and also the County of Orange's Orange County Archives, these being from UCI. And there's a lot of talk, I think, these days about why representation matters, although representation is not to be confused with liberation. But in looking at the way representation impacts social norms, impacts dominant culture, asking the question of why such things as KKK ephemera relate to a present rhetoric of the patriot, it's almost uncanny. So there's a very direct connection in the specific language, in this torn piece that's central in the image, it asks the question, am I a real American? And questioning the elements of what makes someone a real American as an allegiance to white supremacy is clear in the articulation. It's clear in the questioning. It's not that dissimilar from how we hear rhetoric tossed around today. So I think if representation matters in the archive, we can also learn from it how it is impacting our current belief systems. It hasn't changed that much. And one of the things I've been noticing as I've been going through these materials, which are around 100 years old in a lot of cases, up until the late 80s and 90s, is that the change is so minute, which is disturbing, I think, on a different level. The other part of this, and this was more relevant, I think, when I was working in residence earlier this past month, was the KKK presence in Newport Beach, which, if anyone's familiar with the geography of Orange County, came as no surprise because Huntington Beach and Newport Beach have had a presence of neo-Nazism for a long time. So that emerged, and there were pamphlets and a lot of commotion around the KKK organizing a White Lives Matter rally. So I think just trying to pull those connections into the present, how these types of materials that date back are still recirculating today. There are also other norms that came out of Orange County in the 80s around libertarian ideology or conservative leaning ideology. Those of you familiar with Not in Our Backyard politics, I feel like California and Orange County specifically are like the base for that. And this diagram, which includes all the things of the likely Mr. Orange County at the time, and I think this was 88, just kind of outlined the way in which gender norms and domesticity were being articulated that have actually held, I can say from having been a resident there for a very long time, have still held in a sort of conservative, more in the range of maybe what Orange County used to be. It is changing, but I think just, again, recognizing the power of representation in some of these histories. It also connects a bit to California's Prop 187, which was known as Save Our State. It was like a 1994 initiative on the ballot that was meant to prohibit undocumented immigrants from using non-emergency healthcare and public education and other services in the state. And so this was proposed in the early mid-90s and was later then found unconstitutional, but it was part of that ideology. So I think just recognizing that the way policy also impacts ethos and the way people are treated is a crucial part of digging through these types of materials. And so as I'm continuing to work through it, I'm also finding much deeper discontents that are hidden in the way that landowners regarded migrant labor. And so these particular images feel a little bit more benign in that there's no specific articulation, but just looking at some of the ways land was documented. So a more picturesque version of the landscape, agricultural fields on the right hand, and packing houses on the left hand. And the other aspect of profit with regard to agricultural labor is thinking about the way things were marketed. So a big producer and moneymaker is the avocado, which was imported in and farmed, reminds me a lot of the Briquera program that came up in the 1940s, which brought Mexican workers to the US for very low paying agricultural jobs, which went on for a bit, followed by Operation Wetback in 1954. And the way that Mexican day laborers were treated after that point. So that sort of intense shift between post-World War II era of day laborers, low-paying agricultural work, also coinciding the 1936 citrus war. So all of this kind of happening within this 20-year span. And the treatment and the derogatory comments and the sort of racialized slurs, you can see a correlation across years as all this starts to happen. Why I think so much about this is just trying to understand how does that inform the present, and where did some of these notions of normalcy and treatment towards Mexican Americans come from? And so as you start to make the connection between profit and also labor, and seeing power as something that is constantly being sort of held for those who have maintained power, and that connection to white supremacy, it textures the way that the images function. They're no longer just subtle, benign images. They have these very violent histories to them. So something like the avocado, which can seem just like a fruit, is also a really complicated object. And then this is my last archival image. This one is the split between language and when bilingual language is used. This is something I'm thinking about a lot as I'm kind of trying to figure out where these histories exist in these archives, is the importance of knowing when bilingual language would denote that there's a consequence versus when bilingual language is not considered because it's meant to be exclusionary. So in this case, the consequence is that if you pick the avocados, you'll be persecuted. And so that needing to be clearly defined in Spanish and English. So there are aspects of this specific company, the Irvine company, that I've been very interested in. They were the ones who also had the negative that was rewritten as wetbacks on ladders. And just, again, drawing those connections between how practices of, we'll say in isolation, this company, how those practices inform overall treatment, how much land that company owned, how that company then developed most of South Orange County, and just being able to see maybe where their values were at. So this aspect of thinking about the way communication is being used, making assumptions, it's presumptuous, of theft, of how migrant workers might be treating their employers. There are a lot of things there that are sort of veiled or hidden into the materials, into the ephemera, that can't always be understood when written histories. If you read a book like this, if this is not an object in the book, then you're missing that element. So I'm trying to find the relationship or the representations that could potentially come into this project. I just haven't figured out where exactly they will exist yet. Okay, and I have one more video. So this video is like a reel. It's a filmic work that's in progress. It's a combination of footage and materials I'm considering using. It's not a finalized thought. It's more like a sketch for a finalized thought. And the oranges, which are a constant motif in this work, come up again. They're in here. And they're sort of that metaphor for how complicated home is for many people. So they'll appear along with some other things. I think the closing sentiment I would just like to say is that the project is really intended to humanize the experience of being from such a region and to also provide space for counter narratives to emerge. So questioning how Orange County's historically authorial whiteness has been perceived, but also opening up space to share stories about those who are less known within that space. Right, that is it.
Thank you so much. So we will open for questions. If anyone has a question, you can either raise hand or pop it in the chat. I would just like to start by saying that I think that what is so strong about the work is the way that you bring this element of almost like time confusion of place and space. And I think that especially when it comes to a place like Orange County, which is so rooted in one ideology and thought, and we have one impression, to bring these, the way you use film particularly, and the way you use film photography, it adds this element of I think dislocation that's really beautiful.
Thanks, Corinne.
So I was wondering if maybe some of your thoughts on kind of how the archive is not static, and people. Oh wait, sorry. You know what? I'm gonna let Anne go, and then I'm going to go with my question.
Hi, sorry, I'm a little bit disheveled, which is why I had my camera off. But this is a great talk, Lindsay. Just to build off what Corinne was saying, I'm really interested in temporality with your work, and I was wondering if you could speak about like futurity and a sense of the past. And I was really struck by the strike through, the archival document you showed with the strike through. It's multiple temporalities there. It's the past inscription, and then the strike through is like sort of reading into the future and changing future interpretations. So I was wondering if you could speak about how you play with temporality and the sense of time dislocation, like Corinne described, to sort of think about these multiple subject positions and definitions of the identity of Orange County, like futurity and like who occupies the future and who occupies the past.
Yeah, very so well said. I think, I mean, the strike through one to me is like the most active of the materials, although some of the other materials are too, but not as much with the hand notation. Like that's the one where you can tell even in the description, like the original one is in cursive and the strike through is in caps, and it's probably not the same person who wrote it. It just doesn't it would be shocking if it were. But I think that that idea that we rewrite, like how history is rewritten and how in an archival material that actually becomes visible, rendered visible in a way that representation doesn't do the same way in language. In language, we can cut it from the edit. In a physical material that it has the strike through, like it's visible. It wasn't like, even if it were redacted with like whiteout or something, it would still be visible as a very physical redaction. So I think in terms of futurity is like, where does that go? How does that get recirculated? In particular in this project, like I am in the process of seeking permissions to have these things published, that it will take on really different meaning if it becomes a part of a different kind of project in like 2022. But as far as the temporality of it, I mean, I think just the ability for archives to really not be this fixed thing. Like, I don't believe that history is just, I guess, like just recorded and then we're like, that's history with capital H. Like, it's not. And it's shifty. So it speaks to that. It actually has its own kind of temporality that is a bit boundless, just in knowing how history is often produced.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's I think that, you know, if you want to speak more about just these ideas again about how the archive is never static. And we have this idea that when something's in an archive, it's fixed. But I think that when you start bringing it up in relation to like these images, you get this duality that's just really interesting. So if you want to speak a little bit more about the role of, you know, there's like image archive and then there's text archive. So how do you feel about using both things in which one speaks to you more and in relation to your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like I have a personal preference or sort of like bias for language. Like I wish that I were just a writer many times over, but I'm not. I'm a maker of things and I have to figure out how to reconcile language with the images. I think that maybe just trying to figure out if it is about language being slippery and if it's about language trying to create that mental space or that mental image for the fact that archives are not static. So much as it is about showing those moments where archives aren't static. So like, again, I'll use that image as an example. Like that's an active image for saying like, here's a moment in which we see the slippage happen between hands, between people. I mean, more than like a person involved, even in terms of like who's behind the camera, who took the image, who wrote the index, like who indexed it, who then rewrote it or redacted it, and who collected, because the local historian whose archive that's from, has a whole different positionality. And that's, I didn't like in this short of a talk, like I can't, there's just too much ground to cover, but essentially like that person also holds a kind of privilege. And while a local historian like also has a slant and also has a bend to how they're thinking about the history of Orange County, which was through a much more dominant lens. I was actually quite shocked to find the things I found in his archive that I did. So I guess just knowing that there's so much room for positioning. I mean, that's all we are doing as makers. I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity that comes into the work anyway, just knowing like, I'm going to have my lens and I have my own agenda of how I want something to be perceived. And I want it to be perceived to counter the more dominant narratives that have existed around these spaces. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that does. Yeah, and I think that that's something that we could also extrapolate on is the role of the privileged role of the archivist, and almost how in archives we have this really tangible way of deleting that we just don't. I mean, once something is digitally produced, it exists forever in a way that the printed material can't. So it's I think there's also this element of like identifying how things can be shifted.
Definitely.
All right, any other questions from the audience?
I came in late, 30 minutes late, but I have a question.
Did we lose sound?
Yep, sorry.
Oh, is there
I just
more of
unmuted you.
oh, sorry. Is there more of a like inclusive culture in Orange County now versus when it was all white or was mostly racist?
Yeah, I mean, the irony would be like, I still think it's super racist, but it's more veiled.
Right.
And it's definitely more inclusive than
Right.
it was 10 years ago, even. There has been
Yeah.
change, and there are like lots of great on the ground, like mutual aid groups and organizers doing work to counter. But I think it has a long way to go. And like what we saw, even not to like totally go down the land of politics in terms of presidential elections, but I will just say that like there are lots of connections that can be made politically about the ideologies that were espoused both through public health issues as well as presidential election that were like very prevalent on the surface in Orange County in this past couple of years that reminded me that like it hasn't changed that much. But there are people of color in Orange County, and there are definitely like intersectional groups and a lot of amazing people there too.
Yeah, because I always wondered that, because every time I thought about Orange County in Southern California, I found it to be very white, very rich, and very like just really like plastic and just surface level area like attitude there in that particular part of Southern California. And I'm like, I never see people of color here. I don't see people of color who are makers, artists, anything. I just see like white, blonde, you know, blue eyes, and that's literally just it.
Totally. Yeah, I think that it, like in the art part of it, I can speak to a little bit because I was part of that art scene for like a long time. And I do think that that has changed a little bit. Predominantly, like our Mexican population is really high in Southern California and in California in general. So like those would be the spaces that maybe it's more visible. But there are, yes, like I'd say like Orange County's demographics haven't shifted that much, but they're so much better than like 30 years ago would be in the 80s, where some of this research is coming from. But I don't know in terms of like how public facing, like art communities, art groups, I don't think that the coalitions exist as much in those spaces. Santa Ana has some, and like historically has been pretty good about that. But that's where the division happens between South and North. So like I'd say for South, it's much less so. For North, it's more so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Lindsay, one of the things that I was thinking of while looking at the images was also the way that you bring a literalness to the idea of the orange. I think that most people also forget that there's land there that is not taken up by almost these, very commercial capitalistic aspects of Orange County. So maybe if you want to speak about, and you touched briefly on avocado and the orange as portraiture, but like maybe go into a little bit more detail about that, because it was really interesting.
Yeah, so there are like three subjects of the many things that exist in this book. The orange, the avocado, and the palm tree are like those three central icons. Palm tree I have like less developed, so I can't speak to the palm tree right now. But everyone who's from California knows we have many of them. They're not from there. The idea that I think using these icons that feel almost docile. So on the surface that like we may just portray it as like Orange County, that's where oranges come from. Like there's such an identity around that, and Sunkist and the factories and like the packing houses and what those have become today. There's almost, I mean, there's at least one person here who knows this history. The orange groves like don't really exist anymore. They're preserved. They exist in the Orange County Great Park in Irvine, California. And they are almost like an artifice of what was there. You can find like small groves, and there are a couple farms. There are actually some farms still in Irvine, which is where essentially there were also many farms in Garden Grove, which is closer to the dividing in the North County. And the way that those sort of remnants get left behind, oftentimes you have many people with oranges in their backyards. Like so much of North County has citrus everywhere, growing in their backyards that are native, plants that have been there now for a very long time. And the soil is also rich. So like for farming purposes, even if it's in your home, it's much easier to grow that kind of produce. So I think I'm like really considering it in terms of like its own kind of evolution into like, how did people end up with these orange trees, and its connection to the orange groves, but then also the contrived nature of how Orange County got its name, which was about marketing and branding. Not because oranges were just there, just like the avocado. It was a like hot commodity of something that would be easily produced and could withstand the freezes that were happening. The article that I showed is all about the history of the crops freezing. And I think it was like number 15 was the type of avocado crop that did not freeze. So it became then the outlier, the one that could survive winter. The freezing issues that were going on devastated farmland in northern Mexico many times, and also in parts of California. And so those sorts of, I guess, like I'm really actually interested in the farming practices and like what that's meant for migrant labor. And I haven't quite figured out how that will exist in the project, but those are sort of the things I'm thinking about in the portraiture of those icons.
Yeah, that's great. We have got 2 questions here. I'm going to start with Arthur and then go to Heather Raquel. Arthur asks, do you see a way forward in our digital culture to respond dynamically to archives before they become fixed notions of history? Is there a way to address shifting notions of paper archives?
Such a good question, Arthur. Also, Arthur, thank you for being here. I know you're on a different time zone. I think that, that's hard. I don't know. I mean, I think that fixed is tricky because nothing is really fixed. It's fixed in its material form only insofar as it might be like more permanent. Maybe paper is pretty fragile and also not. I think that there's a way to address the shifting notions, I guess, digitally in digital culture, because everything can be digitized. So how does something exist? Like if it's digitized and you're able to look at it on a screen, even if I think of things like VR and AR, how something could be integrated with technologies that might be more dynamic and virtual, and also provides multiplicity in like a virtual interface that could be interpreted. Like I have a friend who was working on a project in letterpress where it was like you're scanning the image and then it's telling you these different histories. So there's a way to sort of hold multiplicity across an image that I think like maybe that's where digital culture like has a lot of ground that could be developed. But there's something unique in a physical object, whether that's like a photograph or some other sort of artifact, that's different. I think they're different things, but it doesn't mean that they don't come together. But I haven't explored those areas as much. So I don't know that I'm the best person to speak to it.
All right, and Heather Raquel?
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Heather.
Thank you for this talk. I'm so glad I am able to catch it. And I keep thinking about, your exploration of like these missing aspects of your identity. And then like through this lens filter process of going through archives and finding things through sort of this other missing information, and how that, mirrors one another, that process. And I identify with that a lot in that search through what isn't there, but that is there, right? And I'm really curious. I just wanted to kind of comment on that, but also like really curious about where you are geographically now and how that speaks to this work, which has, like, when I see your work, I kind of always have that question, like, it's sort of fascinating to me. So I just wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit on that.
Yeah. I think it's hard maybe to make work about the past when you're geographically in a different place, and that it's been strange, like especially because we've been in the pandemic and like I didn't get to travel really. Like I was able to go home for a couple months, but like other than that, I've not spent a significant amount of time in the last year. And it changes my relationship to it, or how like I even experience it, because I'm physically not there. So there's a sort of removal, there's a dislocation in that. And then I think having the work shown, like having the work at PPAC was interesting for me to like see the work on the East Coast and to be like, what meaning does it take on here? It still speaks to these issues of labor. It still speaks to issues of those who are oppressed, but it's not the specificity of Orange County, which I feel like the work is honestly a confrontation of the things about Orange County that I found to be like deeply traumatizing. So it doesn't mean the same thing in Philly necessarily, but I don't know that it renders it like a moot point. I think that it changes maybe the way that work can have multiple reads, or like the relevance of work. But I think that maybe the most important thing that comes to mind is just about how when identity is fragmented, you're like always shape-shifting across space. So whether it's being in California or it's being here or being elsewhere, that there's always that sort of dislocated layer that comes with me no matter where I go, that connects to the identity stuff that you commented on.
Yeah, and I just want to just follow that up with, and I agree with you that bringing it here and showing it here is just kind of creating a larger conversation around the work. And I guess I am curious to see, or to know, or to wonder what that could also be, and what your relationships, and it's kind of an open-ended question, but like what your relationship then becomes to this landscape, and also the shifts in this landscape having to do with different populations that have kind of increased here in recent times, which is, it's interesting and beautiful. And so anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question, if anyone has any other questions that they have. And if not, maybe Lindsay, you can give a quick preview of something that you're working on right now that you're excited about, or something that, I mean, I know you have this book and everything, but maybe something immediate that you're really excited to be working on right now.
Yeah, that's great. Too many things. I have lots of threads of stuff. I just finished a project with Center for Creative Works that was part of their Allies in Art program. And so this, for the Philly folks, if you're in this region or not, I think they will ship it, but you should check out the portfolio. There are a lot of amazing artists at Center for Creative Works that I got to work with collaboratively, and it was a print folio. So it exists in the physical form. It's like the other part of what I do, which is less photocentric. And that would probably be the thing, I would say, like most important thing I've worked on or just finished. Otherwise, I'm a slow maker. It takes me years to complete a project. So I got a lot of like loose end projects, but nothing will be done anytime soon.
Well, that's, we're always going to be on the lookout for what you're up to next. So, all right. Anything else? Any more questions? If not, I'll let everyone go enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. The sun's still kind of out. Lindsay, thank you so much for being here and sharing everything. It was really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see familiar names.
All right.